It should be repeated that the English and Scots, when they meet in battle, fight hard and show great staying power. They do not spare themselves, but go on to the limits of endurance. They are not like the Germans, who make one attack, and then, if they see they cannot break into the enemy's lines and beat him, all turn back in one body. These words were written by the chronicler Jean Froissart, describing the hardiness of Englishmen and Scots in the Middle Ages. Notwithstanding John's dismissive view of their German counterparts, English and Scottish medieval soldiers were certainly not lacking in courage, as displayed frequently in the Scottish Wars of Independence. Usually, when thinking about the Scottish Wars of Independence, your mind will wander to Edward I's interference in Scotland, his attempts to control the Scots through the puppet king John Balliol, and then the uprising of William Wallace, before the wars changed in nature with the succession to the English throne of Edward II in 1307, and the dominance over him by Robert Bruce. But to give context to these tumultuous events, we'll look at the history of the two nations in the centuries prior to the Wars of Independence. When it came to this most ancient of rivalries, you would be forgiven for thinking it was a case of one way English oppression, a larger nation attempting to bully its smaller neighbour. However, this was not always the case. Scottish kings, like many medieval rulers, had their eyes set on expansion, claiming lands that were not theirs by right, but hoped by show of force that one day they would be. If expansion was not the main agenda, then at least causing discomfort for the English was a pleasant thought for many a Scottish king. In the time of the great Anglo Saxon king Athelstan, considered by many to be the first king of the English, the geographical landscape was more fluid than it would later become, as Athelstan and other English rulers oversaw a period of growing control and dominance as they became the primary force in Britain. Naturally, this would cause friction with neighbouring rulers in modern Scotland and Wales, and a particular rivalry formed between Athelstan and King Constantine II of Scotland. Athelstan led campaigns into Scotland, indicating he viewed Constantine as a threat to his ever increasing power. Constantine responded in kind, however, by allying himself with the Vikings, only to be utterly destroyed by Athelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, firmly establishing Athelstan as the great force in Britain and protecting his kingdom, which now firmly resembled what we would now recognise as England. In 1093, Malcolm III of Scotland was killed at the Battle of Alnwick, fighting against the English, having done his fair share of meddling in English affairs. His wife was Margaret of Wessex, whose brother Edgar was a claimant to the throne of England, and who would seek refuge in Scotland on more than one occasion as he plotted against William the Conqueror and the Norman oppressors of England. Malcolm and Margaret's daughter Edith would marry King Henry I of England, changing her name to the more Norman name of Matilda, stabilising relationships between England and Scotland for a short time. But instability was never too far away with the two countries, and Matilda's brother, David I of Scotland, would look to exploit internal problems in England to his advantage. Having married the Countess of Huntingdon, David already held influence in England, but he certainly wanted more, and the civil war between King Stephen and David's niece, the Empress Matilda, in a battle for the English crown, presented him with the perfect opportunity. Using his niece's claims as his excuse, David raided the north of England, and although he suffered defeat at the Battle of the Standard in 1138, he would more often than not get the better of the hapless King Stephen. David's grandson, William the Lion, would follow the same path of war against the English, although he would face a much tougher opponent in the shape of Henry II. William's father, another Henry, had briefly profited from David I's activities in the north of England and held the earldom of Northumbria for a short time, and now William hoped to seize it back from the English crown. And with Henry II having to deal with family rebellions, William hoped to exploit this situation perfectly, but found that Henry II, despite his problems in Normandy, was such an effective king, maintained enough loyalty that even though he was not in England, an army of sufficient strength could be raised to repel the Scottish invasion. Relations between the two nations took an altogether different path in 1237 with the signing of the Treaty of York. The Scottish king at that time was Alexander II, who was married to his English counterpart's sister, Joan, the English king at the time being Henry III. This agreement heralded a generally, though not entirely, peaceful period between the two neighbouring countries, as Henry III concentrated his efforts in cocking things up elsewhere. But peace, of course, between England and Scotland would be shattered in quite spectacular fashion by Henry III's son Edward I, who actively sought to establish himself as the dominant man in not only England but Britain, as Athelstan had done centuries before. His subjugation of the Welsh was ruthlessly efficient, and Edward's attempts to suppress the Scots relentless. In 1295, seeking to break the shackles that Edward I was attempting to impose on them, the Scots turned to another of Edward's enemies, the French, for support. The Scots and French signed the Old Alliance, with Edward backed into a dangerous corner. But like any cornered animal, Edward bared his teeth and came out fighting. In 1296, he swept across Scotland, with Balliol no longer serving the purpose the English king desired. Balliol had no option but to abdicate, and Edward chucked him in the Tower of London for a time before eventually John was allowed to retire in peace. The war between Edward I and the Scots had escalated. On the one hand, there was the fierce, battle hardened, and mighty Edward I of England. On the other, the Scottish nobles, led by the heroic William Wallace. It would be a titanic tussle, with momentum swinging back and forth, almost the personification of England's and Scotland's now historic rivalry.